On behalf of the William Jewett Tucker Foundation, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Community Multi-Faith Celebration in honor of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And please join us for a reception at the Hanover Inn immediately following this service. The Tucker Foundation is truly blessed to have many co-sponsors for this service and for Reverend Starsky Wilson's visit, and we'd like to publicly acknowledge and thank them now. The Office of the Provost, the Dean of the College, the Rockefeller Center, the Dartmouth Center for the Advancement of Learning, Dartmouth College Hillel, the Department of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies, the Crawford Fund of the Ethics Institute, and the Institute for Diversity and Equity. Thank you all for your support. And we're also grateful for all who are taking part in today's service, the musicians, the readers, the speakers, and those who have helped behind the scenes. Thank you all. Lastly, I would like to thank Reverend Rena Goldthry, who recommended that I invite Reverend Wilson to give today's sermon. Rena, if you're here, thank you very much. And Reverend Wilson, of course, thank you for accepting that invitation. This is going to be an amazing service. And I hope that it inspires you to think new thoughts, feel new feelings, and most importantly, actively join in the creation of a new society, one which Reverend King referred to as the beloved community, free of all forms of exploitation and oppression, and grounded in love. And so now let us continue with a word of prayer led by our Muslim and multi-faith advisor, Sharif Rosen.
Good afternoon and greetings of peace to all of you.
I forgot Hafiz Shabazz, so invite Hafiz Shabazz to come up and play.
Okay. Reverend Vogel?
So in my excitement for this service, I forgot to invite one of those musical groups to come forward and get us in the mood. You can tell I'm already in the mood. So for the rest of y'all, please, Hafiz Shabazz and his percussion ensemble, please come forward and get us more in the mood.
Perhaps I should have gone first. That is a tough act to follow. Good afternoon, and God's peace be upon all of you. It's quite an honor to be with you today. I've been asked to recite something from the Quran, which I will proceed to do and translate into English and then follow with our collective prayer. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير صدق الله العظيم. In the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. O humanity, indeed we have created you from a single male and female and made you nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. Indeed, the most honorable among you in the sight of God is the one who is most God-conscious. Indeed, God is all-knowing, all-aware, and God speaks the truth. As we gather this afternoon, the tensions and instability in parts of this nation and this world as a whole is quite palpable. Yet as virtues like patience, resilience, boundless compassion, and empathy are undoubtedly part of our collective work moving forward, there is something else I would like us to intend for ourselves today in gathering here and to pray for in earnest. It is something that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, prayed for when he said, Allahumma arina al-ashya kama hiya. He said, O God, help me to see things as they truly are. His was a prayer for clarity. Let us pray too that this gathering be a step towards clarity in disorienting times. May this gathering be part of our greater task of strengthening bonds of affection, friendship, community building, and truly getting to know one another. May we recommit to the work of appreciative dialogue and broad engagement across our diversity. May we free ourselves of self-righteous, self-serving notions of quote-unquote exceptionalism based on our national origin, race, gender, or creed. May we be wise and just stewards of the earth's natural resources. May we affirm the worth and value of all creation. May we honor the sanctity, dignity, and worth of all human life in all times and places. May we not be indifferent and unmoved by suffering and injustice in all times and places. And may we have the courage to engage in self-examination and reflection before we are moved to act. Amen.
As the gospel choir gets in place, our first selection is going to be We Shall Overcome, which I'm told you're going to hear 3 times today. But we're going to give a rendition, and we're going to sing it to you. We want you to feel this message of love and faith and inspiration, and we're going to try to give it to you represented to the way we're standing. We're going to give you gospel choir and surround sound. So some will be behind you and some will be in front of you. And I want you to think of this as a representation of the love that this day represents, that we're singing, We Shall Overcome, in this nice representation. If you want to, you can clap your hands with us if you want to. It's okay, it's not against the rules. This is where you really can join us if you want to. You can stand up if you want to. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Can you see me? We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Again. We shall overcome. 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 Again. We shall overcome. Again. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Down. Down in my life, I do believe. peak bounce. Good.
"300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot be expected to find voice in a whisper. The storm clouds did not release a gentle rain from heaven, but a whirlwind, which has not yet spent its force or attained its full momentum. Because there is more to come, because American society is bewildered by the spectacle of the Negro in revolt, because the dimensions are vast and the implications deep in a nation with 20 million Negroes. It is important to understand the history that is being made today." Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. God, the most gracious, most merciful. O you who believe, be maintainers of justice, bearers of witness of Allah's sake, though it may be against your own selves, or your parents, or your near relatives. If he be rich or poor, Allah is nearer to them both in compassion. Therefore, do not follow your low desires, lest you deviate. And if you swerve or turn aside, then surely Allah is aware of what you do. Chapter 4, verse 135 from the Quran.
You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, that is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and fosters such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. Reverend King.
Tzedek, tzedek. Tirdof lema'an tiyeh v'yarashta et haaretz, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach. Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord God gives you. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 20.
Time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men and women willing to work to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively, in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. Reverend King.
Hatred can never put an end to hatred. Love alone can. This is an unalterable law. The Buddha.
In assessing the summer's events, some observers have tended to diminish the achievement by treating the demonstration as an end in themselves. The heroism of the marching, the drama of the confrontation, became in their minds the total accomplishment. It is true that these elements have meaning, but to ignore the concrete and specific gains in dismantling the structure of segregation is like noticing the beauty of the rain, but failing to see that it has enriched the soil. A social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. A movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution.
Good afternoon. I'm Teresa Ellis, the Interim Dean of the Tucker Foundation, and it is a pleasure to see Rollins Chapel so full this afternoon as we celebrate the legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King. Thank you all for making your way out, especially in the midst of the slipperiness we are experiencing. I am also really delighted to be able to welcome Reverend Starsky Wilson to campus today, and for the last 3 days he has been here sharing generously of his time, which I know is a real gift when he's away from his family. I will confess to you all that I was slow to write this introduction. It was hard to think about what I could say adequately to introduce a man who bore witness to the horrific events of Ferguson, Missouri this fall. And as I was talking last week with a friend of mine over dinner about our lives and the things that were going on, and I was saying, you know, I'm really struggling with this, she said to me something like this: gosh, it must be so hard. How do you even relate to a black minister from Missouri? Well, aside from being from the middle of the country also, I realized in that moment, and I was reminded that we relate because we are both parents, among other things. Parents who want to keep our children safe in a world, though, that treats our children differently because of the color of their skin. And so my job, or at least one of them, as a very privileged white woman working here at a very privileged institution, is to engage that friend in a conversation about our shared humanity, to help her recognize the things that we all share as parents, as mothers, as sisters, as brothers, as sons and daughters. And so that night, my friend and I started a conversation about all the ways that we are the same rather than the ways that we are different, which I think is where we like in this country to take this conversation. And in the course of that conversation, I was reminded of one quote that sits on my desk, and I read it every day as I start my work. It's a quote from Toni Morrison, and she writes, "When you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game." What a privilege it is to be able to introduce Reverend Starsky Wilson today, whose life's work, I think, really bears testament to Ms. Morrison's words. He currently serves as the president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, a faith-based grant-making initiative devoted to making children's well-being a civic priority in the St. Louis region. He also serves as the pastor of St. John's Church, the beloved community, where he has led congregational activism on issues ranging from youth violence prevention to voter mobilization to raising the minimum wage. And this fall, Governor Jeremiah Nixon of Missouri appointed Reverend Wilson to co-chair the Ferguson Commission, which is studying the underlying conditions and making policy recommendations to help the region progress through the issues exposed by the tragic death of Michael Brown Jr. And in addition to all of that, Reverend Wilson's community leadership includes work on the board of the United Church of Christ Cornerstone Foundation, the YMCA of Greater St. Louis, Teach for America St. Louis, and Focus St. Louis. He has won numerous awards, including most recently a 40 under 40 from the St. Louis Business Journal, and he received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Xavier University in Louisiana, a Master's of Divinity from Eden Theological Seminary, and I must say, in the midst of all of that, in his spare time, is pursuing a doctorate of ministry from Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Wilson.
Good afternoon.
It is indeed an honor and pleasure to be here with you. One of the things we say in the church, when there's a long list of people to recognize, but you know people are cognizant of time, you say things like, protocol being established. So I do lift up just very briefly the president with thanks for being here. My most immediate and constant host, Reverend Nancy Fogley, and an unofficial host that have made me quite welcome, the various student groups whom we've been with throughout our time here, with specific shout out, if you will, to Nia and Rachel and the crew from Morning Glory. The hardest thing, I know we try to get away and we believe in self-care and all of that kind of stuff. The hardest thing for a preacher to do is not be in worship on Sunday morning. And this morning they helped me find a worship service at Qatar Shabazz and allowed me to participate. And for that, we give God thanks and we give God praise. We are thankful for the opportunity to be here today. My one regret is that I will not be here on tomorrow to hear words lifted by a bit of a matriarch, if you will, Dr. Ella Bell Smith. I say matriarch for a number of reasons, but mainly personally, because my mama's name is Ella too, and so I made sure that she knew she had to adopt me while I was here. So, and she is taking good care. I want to invite your attention for a few moments. I'll lift another reading for your hearing from Christian scriptures from the Gospel of John, the 11th chapter. A bit of an extended reading, and the deal I make with my congregation at St. John's is that if I have an extended reading, that means I must have a shorter sermon. That's how they react too. The 17th verse of that 11th chapter reads this way, and I'm going to read through near the close of the chapter. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary, and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out, so they followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed and his spirit deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" When Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb, it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with the strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. So ends the reading. For the time that is mine, I'd like to reflect on the topic that has been lifted before you, Selma to Ferguson, why we can't wait. The narrative that is told, there's something going on. Mary and Martha, who know Jesus well, who have been his friend, and Lazarus, who is called his friend, even one whom Jesus loved, are mourning the loss of this brother Lazarus. And the text gives an interesting diagnosis for why Lazarus has died. It raises the question of a particular urgency and a challenge after illustrating that Jesus has been delayed. Jesus is not present with them. Jesus hangs around a little longer where he is after he gets the news of his brother being ill. Jesus engages in a dialogue with his disciples about whether he should go at a particular time. He deals with, we see earlier in the verse, a little bit of sarcasm from one of his disciples who says, yeah, we're going to go ahead and go back to the place where they were trying to kill you before, and if you're going to go, we're going to go die with you. And Mary and Martha raise the issue of how and why Lazarus died with these words of diagnosis. If you had been here, our brother would not have died. Mary and Martha give less than a medical diagnosis, but rather a theological and a communal one. They suggest something about the urgency of the presence of Jesus. Jesus, whom they understand to be the Son of God, and he who has come to be known by some people who have engaged him to be the very presence of God. And they come through a tradition that tells them that God is present when God's people are present. Jesus has been delayed, and to them this means God has been delayed. But they have faith to believe that if God had been there, their brother would not have died. They are concerned about the delay because God's reputation is on the line. I believe this is part of what was going on 50 years ago, when the people who gathered beginning in January in Selma, Alabama, began to heighten their campaign that was led by the Dallas County Voters League many months before. Their attempts to register African American voters in that county that had been thwarted by those who would turn them away with poll taxes and tests of their literacy and their knowledge of the system. Those who had turned away 300 African Americans lined up to register to vote just months before. Those who, because of a peaceful protest in the streets, shot Jimmy Lee Jackson dead as he sought to care for his ailing father. Those who had been watching James Bevel, the leader of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, when he spoke at Jimmy Lee Jackson's funeral, and reading from arguably the least holy book in the Bible, because it doesn't mention God even once. Reading the story of Esther, he suggests in the sermon, in the eulogy, that we've got to go into the king being the seat of power in Montgomery. And then confirmation came a few days later when Martin Luther King came on the scene and suggested, yes, indeed, there would be a march from Selma to Montgomery. And they began to organize with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under the leadership of John Lewis and Reverend Hosea Williams, coordinating such that on March 7th, 1965, they set out from the church, Brown Chapel, I believe it was, to go forth across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and begin a march that would take 5 days, just 5 days, to get into Montgomery. And on that day, that Christian holy day, after they set out 600 of them from the church house to go forth to march towards God's justice across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, those who were paid to take care of them, to watch out for them, to look over them, by a state with their own tax dollars, rather turned tear gas on them, rather trample them with horses, rather beat them with whips of cords, while the entire nation watched on TV. These people, led by a Christian preacher and a young student, these people who launched out from the church, these people who sought to work towards God's justice on a holy day of their tradition, were beaten on a bridge in front of America, and all of a sudden, God's reputation was on the line. Who is this God that is served that allows God's people to die? Who is this God that is served that allows God's people to be beaten? What is this justice that they work toward, that this God they have faith in has promised them but seemingly cannot deliver? If that God had been present, then perhaps our brothers and our sisters would not have died. This is the challenge to the faith community, from young students and millennials and those of student age, and quite frankly, those just ordinary folk who gathered in the streets of Ferguson on August 9th. The young people who got tired of seeing preachers come and pray in the daytime and go home at night because the police came out at night to beat them. The police came at night to tear gas them. The police came out at night with rubber bullets. And so when the morning came and the people of faith came back with their canned goods, diapers, and formula, they said to them, as Mary and Martha said to the representation of God that came to them, if you had been here. Perhaps Michael would not have died. Why can't we wait? Because God's reputation is on the line. Now, let me be clear for a moment. I read the Bible, I take it seriously, even when I don't take it literally. And if I take it seriously, I know that Mary and Martha are clear that the reason Lazarus died is because the presence of the people of God was absent from Lazarus. Not that Lazarus was not present with the people of God. Somebody missed it, so I'll keep on going. It's not that Lazarus was not a respectable member of a church, synagogue, or mosque. It's not that Lazarus was not appropriately engaged with liturgical attire. It's not that Lazarus somehow should have been with Jesus. Rather, the body of Christ and the representation of the church had a responsibility to be with Lazarus, at the point of his death. If you had been in the streets, if you had been in the school, the unaccredited school district that I grew up from, I would not have died. If you had signed up for Big Brothers Big Sisters when I signed up 3 years ago for a mentor and they didn't have enough to go around, I would not have died. If you had shown up in the streets in the neighborhoods where you criminalized me such that you made me get a ticket for having my pants hanging down, I would not have. The reason why we can't wait is because God's reputation is on the line. There are people who believe what we have told them about God. They believe that God is a God of peace and God is a God of justice. They believe that God desires that multicultural, multi-faith, multi-ethnic community of peace and justice where love is the governing ethic that Dr. King preached about. They believe that God inspires and God can transform. They believe the things we tell them about God in our tradition. And so when they are visited with the kinds of things that they saw on television on March 7th, 1965, or the things that they saw on television on August 10th, 2014, they look to communities of faith and they say, "Where is your God?" I lift this from this particular passage of the Gospel of John because the writer of John's Gospel is trying to make the argument that God is present through the person of Jesus. He goes out of his way to include these miraculous activities of Jesus, changing water to wine, healing a royal official's son, healing a paralytic at Bethesda, feeding of 5,000 in John chapter 6, Jesus walking on the water, the healing of the man born blind, and then getting to this climactic raising of Lazarus from the dead. He's trying to make the case for the reputation of God. And here he is confronted with the conflict of the absence of God. And this absence comes because of the absence of God's people. And what we've reached in this moment is the kind of critique that King had to respond to in March of 1965. We've got to finish this thing. Not because SELC is on the line. Not because the student nonviolent coordinator, not because Dr. King is on the line, not because the system, not because Lyndon Johnson is on the line, but God's reputation is on the line. And so in the coming weeks, King deals with significant pressure to finish the march, pressure that he, quite frankly, is not ready for. And 2 days later, they launch out again on the 9th on what is called now Turnaround Tuesday. Because they launch out and get to the other side, and although he's been negotiating for protection for the marchers, he's not been able to get covering from the government. So King goes out, and knowing what could befall them on the other side, he stops in the middle of the bridge and then gives a prayer, turns around, and walks everyone back. Here, the pressure is heightened because people have come from all over the nation responding to a call to be the present people of God and perhaps to redeem God's reputation. And they have then come together, and they're still gathered there while King is vacillating and negotiating and trying to work things out to get cover for the people. And in the meantime, a clergyman who has come down to make sure God is present and responded to the call from what he has seen with God's people being taken advantage of, he then gets killed in the city. So again, God's reputation is placed on the line. So we've got to finish this thing, Doc. Martin, whether they bring word down or not, whether they protect the people or not, we've got to go across because the movement hinges on whether these gathered people of faith will make their journey to justice, whether they'll take their message to what James Bevel called the king. Will they make it to Montgomery? And so finally, days later, on about the 20th, they gather again, noting, perhaps as Jesus notes in this text, that if the critics can get it to stick, this is a mark on their ministry that is marred. If the critics can get it to stick, this is a critique of the character of the cause. If the critics can get it to stick, this is the loss in the lore of the movement. If the critics can get it to stick, this is a problem for those who confront power. But in case anybody missed it so far, I must be clear, and then I'm almost done. God's reputation ain't the only one on the line. I've been telling people to follow a brother by the name of DeRay McKesson on Twitter. I say that to the student groups because, you know, about half of this room not doing Twitter. It's not a critique, I'm just saying. One of these young men is DeRay. DeRay, I tell people, is part journalist and part Bayard Rustin. He has committed his skills on Twitter and live streaming to spreading this movement. And DeRay raised the question on the last day of the year. He noted his great disappointment with the historic black church tradition because it had not shown up in protest and resistance beside its children that it had sent to school like himself. Young people, activists, and protesters are saying that if you had just been here, the faith community had been here, our brother Michael would not have died. And to be clear, no one is making the case. I'm simply saying that the responsibility lies with us. Borrowing from the same big brothers and sisters in radical monotheism in the Jewish tradition, like Mary and Martha, that God is present when God's people are present. God is engaged in the struggle for justice when God's people are engaged in the struggle for justice. And we still find that the minority of God's people are engaged in this struggle for justice. Now, we are not disheartened by this, quite frankly, because it was the same was the such with King. I know it's hard to find anybody who was alive in 1965 who wasn't marching with King. Somehow, he got really popular many years later, kind of like Jesus. But I want to offer that the text tells us something else, and I really am about done, and I'll run through it quickly, about how we might redeem God's righteous reputation. And I think we follow the steps that we see in the rabbi from Nazareth here in the text. First of all, I think we must actually arrive. Jesus gets the critique when he shows up that it's taken him too long. If you just had been here, then my brother would not have died. That's fine, take the critique, but at some point, we've got to arrive on the scene. After we arrive, we must accept responsibility. There is this famous text that Christians like to lift up about Jesus. I am the resurrection and the life. We like to point that out because we think it makes us so religiously exceptional that we are following the resurrection and the life. I like to lift it up because I don't think Jesus here is talking about how special he is. I actually think he's accepting responsibility for the party he came late to. Jesus says, yes, he is gone, but the capacity and responsibility for his life is mine. Oh, that the people of God, no matter how they claim God, would say, I have responsibility for the loss of life of Michael and of Tamir and of Eric and of John and of Ezel. We've got to actually arrive. We've got to accept responsibility. Then we ought to ask questions before giving directions. One of the things I found on the street all the time, see preachers, black preachers particularly, the ones who like to wear handkerchiefs and three-piece suits and show up. They showed up in the street as if they had authority and began to tell people on the protest line what to do. And my man Tef Poe, you ought to follow Tef too, and my man Tef Poe was one who would put everything in order, because the responsibility on the line and the authority on the line out there came from how long you had been there. And so Tef would say stuff like, man, get your once a week self to the back of the line. Because some of us have been out here every day, early in the morning, late into the night, only going to change clothes and bring back water and food. But after you arrive, you got to ask folk who have been there before you, affirm that they have answers that you don't have before you enter into the battle that they have been leading. First, we've got to actually arrive. Second, we've got to accept responsibility. Then we've got to ask questions before giving direction. Then this next one is real helpful for folk in these multi-faith spaces. We've got to affirm the actions of others. They might not act like we act. They might not show up like we show up. They might not do it how we would have done it. But Jesus, before he does anything, says to the people, take away the stone. Maybe because he knew that the stone was too big, the barrier was too high, that it was a little too much for him to handle on his own. It required the hands of the entire community to take away the barriers to the life-giving possibilities for those Michaels who had been killed. And after we affirm the actions of others, we must act as expected. I like the fact that Jesus doesn't stop being Jesus for the sake of a diverse crowd. Jesus stops and prays in the middle of the crowd, and he does so for the sake of them knowing not that he needed to talk to God, not that he believed God wasn't going to hear him unless he prayed out loud. Rather, he prayed so that people would know who he was in the midst of the space. This is where we ought to evolve. And I'm sorry, I spent a good amount of time in Interfaith Dialogue. I was the vice president of Interfaith Partnership there in St. Louis. And one of the great challenges for us is that people thought that interfaith or multi-faith meant no faith. That you couldn't show up as a Muslim in a space with a Christian and still be Muslim in all that you are. Jesus acted as expected. He prayed and was pious in public, just like people expected him to. People expect us to do what we say we're going to do. People expect us to rely on God. People respect us to call on God's spiritual power. And people respond to our authenticity when we do what we say we're going to do. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm done. I like the fact that it ends by Jesus addressing the affected by name. Because the name in and of itself is a call to action. One of the things we have not done enough in this battle against police violence and brutality in our communities and throughout the nation is lifted up the names. Perhaps we're afraid to do so because when you call the name, it's a call to action. So every now and then we got to call the names. Tamir Rice, Akai Gurley, Victor White III, Dante Parker, Kajimi Powell, Ezell Ford, Michael Brown, Mackenzie Cochran, Tyree Woodson, John Crawford III, Eric Garner, Yvette Smith, Jordan Baker, Barrington Williams, Andy Lopez, Carlos Alcis, Dion Flood, Jonathan Farrow, Kimani Gray, Kyam Livingston, Larry Eugene Jackson Jr., Miriam Carey, Chavis Carter, Dante Price, Dwayne Brown, Irvin Jefferson, Jersey Green, Johnny Kamahi Warren, Justin Slip, Kendrick McDade, Melissa Williams, Nehemiah Dillard, Ramarley Graham, Raymond Allen, Rakia Boyd, Ronaldo Cuevas, Robert Dumas Jr., Sergeant Manuel Loggins Jr., Chantel Davis, Charmel Edwards, Sharice Francis, Timone Robinson, Timothy Russell, Wendell Allen, Alonzo Ashley, Jamel Cannon, Kenneth Chamberlain, Kenneth Harding, Raheem Brown, Reginald Doucette, Aaron Campbell, Ayanna Jones, Danroy Henry, Derek Jones, Stephen Eugene Washington, Kiwani Carrington, Oscar Grant, Shem Walker, Victor Steen, Tarika Willis, Deontay Terrell, Sean Bell, Henry Glover, James Brissett, Ronald Madison, Timothy Stansberry, Alberta Sproul, Orlando Barlow, Usmani Zongo, Timothy Thomas, Earl Murray, Malcolm Ferguson, Patrick Dorismond, Prince Jones, Ronald Beasley lengthy and my incomplete list of those who have been cut down by police violence since 2000 lands with Amadou Diallo. We've got to call the names for the sake of being called to action. Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus, which is a Latinized version of the name Eleazar, which is captured in Eleazar Wheelock at the bottom of this stained glass window. Eleazar, which says very clearly, God is my help. When we call the name, we're called to action. Because Eleazar, Lazarus, says, God is my help. Then when we trace it from this sanctuary to the streets of Ferguson, August 9th, we lift the name Michael, whose etymology means, who is like God? When we call the names, we are called to action. They couldn't wait in Ferguson. They couldn't wait in Selma. Because God's name, God's reputation was on the line. And we cannot wait here because we are caught between the call and response of the black church tradition. Lazarus saying, God is my help. And the blood of Michael Brown crying forth from the ground. Who, Dartmouth, who, Rollins, in this room is like God?
As the choir gets in place, we thank you, Reverend Wilson, for your very inspired message on why we can't wait, and we hope to continue the message with the song of Heal the Land, for we truly live in a time where the land is in need of healing. So as you listen to this song, just reflect of the time that we're in as the choir sings Heal the Land.
Innocent blood in the land, so much killing in the land. People are dying in the land. My prayer is to heal the land.
There is hatred in the land. There is crime My prayer is to heal the land, heal the land. Heal the land. Oh, oh. Heal the land. Heal the land. My prayer is to heal the land, to heal the land. Lord, we need you. Heal the land. To heal the land, yeah. Heal the land. My prayer is, Lord, heal the land. To heal the land.
So much trouble in the land. There is no peace down in the land. Gangs are on the uprise in the land. My prayer is to heal the land, heal the land. Heal the land. My prayer is to heal the land, Lord. Heal the land, my prayer is to heal the land.
So many crises here in the land. Guns and drugs here in the land. There is no love in the land. My prayer is to heal the land, heal the
My name is Andrew Nalani. I'm the student director of the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at the Tucker Foundation. In Luganda, the language of central Uganda where I come from, there's a short proverb of 2 words, Gacha Limabaga. Translated literally, these words mean a lot has been done, much more remains to do. A lot has been done, much more remains to do. Today we celebrate a legacy that was courageous enough to reimagine what a just world might look like. A legacy that makes it possible for many in this room, myself included, to sit side by side. A lot has been done, much more remains to do. Our generation stands at a similar threshold yet again, with a familiar task to reimagine what justice might look like. It is a familiar task, but its complexity is enormous. Meanwhile, opportunities and incentives increase by the day to distract us and to divert us from remaining awake and alert. The task before us is familiar. When the shadows of Selma resurrect in Ferguson, we cannot navigate the complexity of the injustice before us in a state of slumber and disengagement. The poet David White writes and says, alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. I stand here this afternoon to bear witness to how students and other members of the Dartmouth community have stepped upon this threshold of familiarity and have chosen to remain alert, to stay awake while navigating the increasing complexity of power structures that rob many of their humanity. This past year, several students called out to and kept watch as they stood side by side with each other through participating in vigils and protests disrupting business as usual. On April 1st, students presented the Freedom Budget. Theirs was a call to inclusion and campus safety for those of us who stand at the periphery of this institution, including students, staff, and faculty of color. These same students protested by sitting in the president's office overnight. On April 22nd, members of the community participated in Take Back the Night, a rally and march against sexual assault and violence. In June, a vigil was held to honor the precious lives that perished in the 1994 Rwanda genocide. The vigil was called Kwibuka, which in Rwanda means to remember. On July 30th, the student presidents of Al-Noor and Hillel, which are the campus groups for Muslim and Jewish students respectively, gathered members of their faith communities and other allies to join in a candlelight prayer vigil for peace, justice, and human dignity in Gaza and Israel. On August 14th, following the tragic death of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, and others, students, faculty, and staff observed a moment of silence on the green to honor those victims of violence, of police brutality, as well as those who have lost their lives to the ferocious and insatiable systems of racism, bigotry, and intolerance. Saturday, September 30th, members of our community and sustainability at Dartmouth who remain alert and awake to the demise of the natural environment organized a bus to New York City to stand in solidarity with the world's largest climate march in history. On November 2nd, concerned students participated in a vigil and procession remembering those who lose their lives every year, trying to cross the border into the US. December 4th, Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies collaborated with Rena Goldtree, collaborated with few students to organize 60 members from the Hanover community to hold signs, stage die-ins, march, and voice concerns about police violence against Black lives. And on January 6th, just 2 days ago, students marched into Baker Berry Library and staged a die-in, raising their voices yet again in solidarity with Black lives against police brutality. Not forgetting to mention the Alpha Phi Alpha Vigil for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. In all these ways and many others, members of our community have kept watch. In all these vigils and protests, they have remained alert on this threshold so familiar and ever so complex. One may ask, what's the use? Why all these vigils if they can't really change anything? What difference does a dying make? These multitudes of voices sitting in, dying in, marching, chanting, are voices refusing to settle in static neutrality. These are voices saying it's not enough to find voice in a whisper, then lock it up in isolation, so that when faced with the walls of oppression, it's nothing but a mist waiting on promises too costly to be made priority. These voices remind us to remain alert and awake to the much more that there is to do. These vigils, These protests are about memory and action. Action requires courage, and our courage to act is renewed when we remember those who have walked the path of resistance before us. I'm thinking of Project Preservation, sponsored by Dartmouth Hillel, a program in which 13 students from diverse backgrounds traveled to former Jewish concentration camps in Eastern Europe, and there they restored cemeteries that were disappearing beneath thickets. To date, the project has documented over 500 headstones in the Lutowiska Jewish Cemetery. Following the experience, one student who was not a Jew asked, "What difference can I make? How can I start making a difference?" Memory disrupts business as usual. The status quo would have us believe that the acts of bigotry are but isolated events, but memory takes us out of our isolation and brings us into community where our courage to act is nurtured. The vigils, the protests are about memory and action. Shortly after participating in Take Back the Night, the rally and march against sexual assault, a Dartmouth senior trained and joined a campus group called Mentors Against Violence to continue the work begun in the protest. The vigil honoring the lives lost while crossing the border fueled action through the Dartmouth Coalition for Immigration Reform, which has held panel discussions and urged students to pledge and sign petitions to drop the I word, illegal. To preserve memory is to preserve life. It's a sacred act. The candles we light during vigils honor the larger story of who we are and where we have been. During these moments of silence, we remember that we are stewards of a sacred legacy. Yes, we may find our individual voice in a whisper, but the white concrete walls of the powers that be will not be moved an inch by a breath of that isolated whisper. In community, these voices of disruption are our wake-up call, our urge to remain alert, and those voices cannot and will not remain silenced because everything is at stake, including our very survival on this planet. There is a price to pay if we go to sleep. And the price we pay for remaining awake is the mistaken innocence of neutrality. We cannot remain awake in isolation. In isolation, our courage is easily extinguished by the enormity, the complexity, and seeming impossibility of the tasks ahead of us. And so we begin with memory. Memory teaches us that all injustice thrives because of isolation, separation, and irreconcilable division. Because of the complex intersections of the injustices we face today, we cannot afford isolation, nor can we retreat into static neutrality. This movement into a new way of belonging with each other depends on the quality of community we build with and for each other. A lot has been done, and much more remains to do. Much remains to be done when the shadows of Selma remain alive in Ferguson. Much remains to be done when the media brings us extensive coverage of the riots, the chaos, the marching happening in France. Meanwhile, countless lives are lost in the hands of Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria, and a white man claims Africa is not a priority. Much remains to be done when bodies of 135 children and 10 adults perish within their own school walls from the Taliban bullets in Pakistan. Much remains to be done when Ugandan legislators sign into law a bill that places non-heteronormative lives in Uganda at the risk of death. And much more remains to be done when any intervention in these issues evokes the colonial legacy our civilization is built upon. This is not a time for whispers. Alone and isolated, our hearts quiver and retreat in fear of the daunting tasks ahead of us. But when we stand together, march arm in arm on the streets, when we choose to engage the difficult questions and refuse any of the easy answers behind negotiation walls, if the potential for violence when our differences conflict is transformed into a creative and generative tension, when those of us who find voice in a whisper refuse to act in isolation, perhaps way will open, perhaps way will begin to open. And this new story might begin to emerge. Light will shine where our demons once lay. It may be then, as Marianne Williamson writes, that as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. And that as we are liberated from our own fear to act towards justice, our presence and action will automatically liberate others. We are all in this together. We protect each other's courage. We remain awake, alert, and courageous in community.
Hello, my name is Alana Folby, and I participated in project preservation in the spring. Every year, Dartmouth College Hillel takes a group of students from different ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds to Eastern Europe to restore the cemetery of a once vibrant Jewish community. Project preservation works to restore the memories of the Jews perished in the Holocaust, and as a result of hate and malice, but it also works to keep fighting on behalf of all those so greatly impacted by genocide, cruelty, and injustice today. Remembrance can and should exist with continuous activism.
My name is Hamza. Madeline and I organized a candlelight vigil for peace and solidarity with the victims of violence in Israel and Gaza, because in times of darkness and chaos, our faiths urge us to shine the light of peace. Our faiths guide us to stand up against the injustices of our time, regardless of the race, nationality, or religion of the victims. And only by coming together under the common cause of peace can we hope for a better tomorrow.
My name is Madeline. This summer, Hamza and I brought together the Jewish and Muslim communities on campus for a joint candlelit prayer vigil for peace, justice, and human dignity, values which are central to our traditions. During this divisive time, we chose to come together in solidarity with all those affected by the violence in Gaza and Israel and stand firmly in support of lasting peace.
Hello, my name is Oscar Cornejo, and with the help of the Latino community at Dartmouth and Dartmouth co-fired our very own immigrant rights group on campus, we organized on Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, a day to remember our loved ones who are no longer with us, and to remember those 43 missing students in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, Mexico, who lost their lives at the stake of the Mexican government, and as well, and most importantly, to remember the lives of those who cross the U.S. borders every single year, risking their lives, and unfortunately lose their lives and are forgotten.
My name is Shweta, and I will translate the prayer Asitoma Sadgamaya. Lead us from illusion to truth. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality.
My name is Aditya Shah, 15, and I will sing the prayer. Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
I do believe we shall overcome someday. Because truth crushed to the earth will rise again. Because no lie can live forever. Because we shall reap what we sow. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. On September 13th, 1989, at a rally in Cape Town, South Africa, Archbishop Desmond Tutu issued an invitation to the newly elected acting president of South Africa. He said, "We've already won, Mr. de Klerk." And then he added, almost pleading, and I know this because I heard it on the radio back in 1989. He added, "Join us in the struggle for this new South Africa. Join us." And 24 years earlier, on March 25th, 1965, at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March, Reverend King said to the crowd, and he says it to us today, "And so as we go away this afternoon, let us go away more than ever before committed to this struggle and committed to nonviolence." These countless religious and moral leaders of yesterday and today, King and Tutu, D. Ray and Tef Po and Alexis, and people like El Haj Malik El Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, who, by the way, visited Dartmouth almost 50 years ago to the day to give a speech for us to join in the struggle, imploring us, pleading us to join them, because the struggle did not end after the marches successfully arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, or when apartheid in South Africa officially ended. It continues. And the task today is not just for the people of Ferguson, Missouri, or the people of New York City. It is for each and every one of us, because as King noted, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. We are all affected by, and we all affect this situation for good or for ill. So let's affect it for good. We are either for justice or against it. As Andrew said, there is no neutral ground, and there is no neutral time. So let us accept the invitation, and let us be for justice, and let us show it in word and in deed. Amen.